thank you for joining us. My name is Beth Marsh, and I am the Director of Membership and Communications for the Organization of American Historians. Today's webinar on pandemic labor organizing and activism in historical perspective is part of the OAH's Future of the Past series, where we engage with recent events so that history can help us better understand the present and inform our shared future. Past webinars in the series can be viewed on our website at www.oah.org. Today's webinar is being recorded and will be posted online in a few days. If you have questions during the webinar, please use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. If you need assistance, please message me or my colleague, Sydney Siegel, using chat. The Future of the Past webinar series is funded by a grant from the National Endowment for the Humanities. It is my pleasure to introduce our moderator for tonight's discussion, Beth English. She is the Executive Director of the Organization of American Historians and an Adjunct Associate Professor of History at Indiana University, Bloomington. She is the author of A Common Thread, Labor, Politics, and Capital Mobility in the Textile Industry, and most recently, a co-editor of Global Women's Work and Transition, Perspectives on Gender and Work in the Global Economy. She is a past president of the Southern Labor Studies Association, as well as the former director of the Project on Gender in the Global Community at Princeton University's School of Public and International Affairs. She received her master's and PhD from the College of William & Mary and has focused her research and teaching on historical and contemporary labor and working class issues, gender, the US South, and globalization. Her research has been funded by the National Endowment for the Humanities and by the International Labor Organization. And now I will turn it over to you, Beth. Thank you.
Thanks, Beth. It's my pleasure to be here with our 4 panelists who I'll introduce, and we have about an hour for conversation, so we'll jump right into it. We'll start off with Claudrena Harold, who is professor and chair of the Corcoran Department of History at the University of Virginia. She is the author of 3 books, The Rise and Fall of the Garvey Movement in the New South, 1918 to 1942, New Negro Politics in the Jim Crow South, and When Sunday Comes, Gospel Music in the Soul and Hip Hop Eras. She has co-edited 2 volumes, The Punitive Turn, New Approaches to Race and Incarceration, and Charlottesville 2017, The Legacy of Race and Inequality. As a part of her ongoing work on African-American life at the University of Virginia, she has co-directed with Kevin Everson 9 short films. So thank you, Claudrena, for joining us. Next, we have William Jones, who is professor and director of graduate studies in the history department at the University of Minnesota, and until days ago, president of the Labor and Working Class History Association. He's now the immediate past president. He is author of The Tribe of Black Ulysses, African-American Lumber Workers in the Jim Crow South, and The March on Washington, Jobs, Freedom, and the Forgotten History of Civil Rights. And his scholarship has appeared in Labor, Studies in Working Class History, International Labor and Working Class History, and the Journal of Urban History. William Jones has been a guest on the PBS NewsHour and NPR's The Takeaway, and has written for the New York Times, the Washington Post, The Nation, and other publications. His forthcoming book is Essential Workers, Public Service, and the Dignity of Labor. Thanks again as well for joining us, Will. Next, we have Mariah Loza, who is an associate professor in the Department of History and the American Studies program at Georgetown University. Her areas of research include Latinx history, labor history, and food studies. Her book, Defiant Braceros: How Migrant Workers Fought for Racial, Sexual, and Political Freedom, examines America's largest guest worker program. It was the winner of the Theodore Salutos Book Prize awarded by the Immigration and Ethnic History Society and the Smithsonian Secretary's Research Prize. Her research has been funded by the Ford Foundation, the National Endowment for the Humanities, and the Smithsonian's Latino Center. Prior to joining the faculty at Georgetown, she taught in the Department of Food Studies at NYU. And in addition, she also curates at the National Museum of American History. So thank you, Mariah, too, for joining us. And last but not least, we have Lane Wyndham, also from Georgetown, where she's Associate Director of the university's Come-Innovitz Initiative for Labor and the Working Poor, and co-director of Will Empower, Women Innovating Labor Leadership. She is author of Knocking on Labor's Door, Union Organizing in the 1970s and the Roots of a New Economic Divide, which was the winner of the 2018 David Montgomery Award. Lane has spent nearly 20 years working in the union movement, including as a union organizer in the South. And she earned her MA and PhD in US history from the University of Maryland and a BA from Duke University. So welcome, Lane, as well. So I thought we could start out with a sort of a general question, and it's drawn from an editorial that Stephen Greenhouse published in The Guardian in January. And in that editorial, he asked, and I'm quoting, "Can worker anger be turned into a movement?" And so when we think about all of the organizing that we're seeing coming out of this pandemic moment, some new, some transitioning into sort of a new environment, we have graduate students, we have Amazon warehouse workers, we have Starbucks baristas. In Will's backyard in Minneapolis, we have a teacher strike happening right now. So we're seeing this sort of surge in union organizing. And so two questions to get us started connected to that larger question: can worker anger be turned into a movement? Number one, thinking historically, are we in an exceptional moment? Or where are we at sort of in the broad arc of labor activism in the modern United States? And how might you then approach and respond to this question about catalyzing worker agency into some sort of sustained movement? So I'll throw it out to our panelists. Who would like to go first? Lane, please.
I'm happy to go. So just thanks to the OAH for having me. I'm excited to join this conversation with Beth and with all my fellow panelists. I'm so excited to hear what everybody has to say. So this question, can worker anger be turned into a movement? And there's a way that the question presumes that there's not already a movement. I think that was certainly true of the piece, the Steve Greenhouse piece that was circulated around. So I'm hoping that as part of our discussion, we can explore to what extent we are already seeing a new workers' movement, and perhaps one that even precedes the pandemic and has been developing since the economic crash of 2008 and 2009. And I think that to see this movement, we're going to have to talk about it outside of union membership statistics and even beyond traditional unions, and think about whether it's related to a possible change in the neoliberal paradigm that has been in place since the 1970s. So I'm going to start there in the 70s, which of course is what my book focused on. That was the decade when our current economic divide took hold alongside, neoliberal ideas. Like today, there was a wave of unionization efforts. It also was led by women and people of color, just like the movement that's happening today, surge of activity. Those workers had gained new access to the job market following the 1964 Civil Rights Act. And as they came into those jobs, they tried to organize them. We know, of course, how this story ends. The employers ramped up their resistance and bent and broke labor law and effectively really broke the US's collective bargaining system in many ways. So the 1970s workers organizing wave failed. And so workers had far less power than they would have otherwise. So shift forward to the 2008, 2009 economic collapse, which inspired a new emphasis on inequality, right? The Occupy movement of 2011. Then remember, there's the launch of the Black Lives Matter movement in 2013, the Me Too movement, the Day Without Immigrants movement of 2017. These all lifted up issues that spotlighted issues of class, intersecting with people's other lived experiences, right? So there's a way in which some of working people's movements have been playing out in what we might also call civil rights or immigrants or feminist movements, right? And then we've also seen over a decade of experimentation with new worker organizations that build power outside of collective bargaining, like those domestic workers who've won bills of rights, the taxi drivers who won debt relief, the restaurant workers who are fighting to end tipping, the Fight for 15 that lifted minimum wages in cities and states. And of course, we are seeing the new activism within existing traditional unions, like the strikes. Remember, there was a strike wave in 2018 and 2019, 500,000 workers a year, including those teachers and the Red for Ed strikes in West Virginia, Oklahoma, and Arizona. And then the pandemic hits, and you have worker activism increases even more. The strikes and organizing, like you mentioned, Beth, the Great Resignation, people voting with their feet and saying, I'm not going to do these bad jobs that have become the norm over the last 40 years. I'm not doing it anymore, right? So I think there's a way in which the pandemic has deepened a shift away possibly from the neoliberal era. It's not gone, but a shift. And that today's worker activism is seeking to shape that new shift. Now, a big difference between the worker activism of the 1970s and now is that in the 1970s, those workers were fighting to gain access to an economic system that they thought worked, right? They'd finally gained greater access to the job market with the Civil Rights Act, and they wanted in to what historians have termed the New Deal order, to job security, all that. Today, that security is gone. The jobs are precarious. You've had 40 years of attacks on unions and collective bargaining. And I think that the workers today, especially the young workers, have far less faith that the economic system kind of works. They're not so much trying to get in sometimes as much as they're trying to change it. So I'm thinking of, for instance, like the graduate employees who are challenging the market-based university, the Amazon workers who are not only unionizing, but challenging the way artificial intelligence is monitoring their workplaces. You know, and then sometimes, again, workers are organizing even outside the realm of collective bargaining at a higher level than in the 70s. So I'll stop there and let somebody else go. But yeah, that's a sum up of how I would approach that question.
Great, thanks, Lane. Will, Mariah, Claudrina, I think is still working on her audio, so feel free to jump in.
Go ahead, Mariah.
Sorry, I was on mute, but I suspect many of this is the year of like, sorry, I was on mute. To prepare for today, I actually asked my students earlier how they'd answer this question. And I think that Lane is definitely right that, you know, an older generation of workers basically thought that the system did work and they wanted their share. But these young folks that are entering the market don't see it that way. And they not only see the erosion of labor rights and basically workers' work-life balance. And today, as we talked about May Day and an 8-hour workday, they said, we can't expect that. And so one of the interesting sort of pivots in the conversation with my students today is that, you know, we talked about this cultural shift also in America, where people take pride in working 10 to 12 hours, where people basically are being highly exploited, but are expected to shine in liking it. And they completely rejected that. And they basically wanted to see something that resembles, you know, a different, completely different system. And they felt a deep empathy for folks who were fighting for an 8-hour work day. They felt a deep empathy for folks that were fighting for safer work environments because they feel they're stepping into unsafe work environments. They also, in general, just feel a deep, you know, a deep sense that, you know, this is not the landscape that their parents entered. And I thought that that was very interesting for the conversation today. And, you know, I said to them, at least in my work, the folks that I've, you know, dedicated a long chunk of time and energy to study are folks that have constantly been up against the wall in terms of organizing. Traditional unions have at times left them out. We have, you know, one success story with the UFW, but we have also folks that are pushing for different models like the CIW that definitely is not a union, And they basically said to me, perhaps what is happening is that we're all experiencing a little of that precarity right now, and that basically the pandemic unpenned that. And the bigger question I asked is, how can we make this landscape better? So if worker anger and rage is supposed to sustain a movement, then what are the things that have to be in place? And, one of their obvious was, we really need to do something to fundamentally change law. And they said, how do we include basically domestic workers, agricultural workers, and now a whole sector of people that work in the service sector economy under more and more protection, right? And then the deeper question I, push them to think about is, and how do basically undocumented workers fit in this landscape? When a workers' movement is, taking off, and the affect of rage and feelings of commitment are there, what can we do, or what do we do with a system that continuously, at least for Latinx, both green card holders historically and undocumented workers, has historically been able to just erase them by deporting them, right? We see this over and over. We saw this in the 1930s, and the 40s, and the 50s, where Latinx leadership that is immigrant and resident green card holders and undocumented people risk basically being in the US. And so how does that erasure continue to happen? And so for them, they had the simple solution. Well, how do we get these people documented? I said, yeah, that's it. That's a bigger structural problem that we need to solve, right? So that this is much more sustainable, so that we don't see a generation of very, very passionate Latinx leaders that are, again, resident green card holders or undocumented, so easily erased. Because at least for the Latinx story, this is something that continuously happens, right? This is a story of basically the long 20th century into the present, that this can so easily be undone. So the bigger question for them is, how do we change the structure so that there is longevity? And lucky to say that my students, those young people are on fire. And I do think that it's partly that adamant feeling and conviction that this is not working. And, when they read basically historical figures like Emma Tenayuca talking about the Great Depression and saying, we all had a deep feeling that capitalism wasn't working. They read that and they say, wow, someone was on the money 90 years ago that was able to say, this isn't working. My math is off, maybe longer. but I do think that they are, working to connect the past to the present and really talking about these struggles and longevity.
So my thoughts, I think, echo a lot of what's been said. And I particularly think it's important to think of this as a movement and one that has a history. And I think, I think thinking about how we understand the history of this movement actually shapes our analysis of it. So I would actually say that I would trace the origins of it back to the May Day marches in 2006, which I think framed immigrant rights as labor rights, as worker rights, and reinvigorated May Day as a Labor Day, something that we haven't seen in the United States for maybe a century. And I think that's a really important sort of starting point for a movement that over the past several decades has really, I think, reoriented the way in which we talk about economics and class and work in very important ways. So I would include the Occupy protests, the protests in Madison in 2011, the Fight for 15 in 2013, and its, I think, important connection to the Black Lives Matter protests, the teachers' strikes in 2018 and 19. And so now we're the Amazon and Starbucks organizing the teachers' strike here in the Twin Cities. And I think those are, the results of a long-standing movement that's had a really tremendous impact on American political thought. It's focused attention on economic inequality, on the importance of unions. I think the degree to which my students know about unions is actually dramatically different from the sort of consciousness of unions among undergraduate students 2 decades ago when I started teaching at the university level. Public approval of labor unions reached its lowest point in history in 2009. It was about 48% of Americans approved of unions, 45% disapproved. The latest polls showed a really a remarkable increase. It's about 68% last year. So a 20% increase in approval ratings of unions. This helped elect both liberals and socialists to office across the United States in, I think, unprecedented levels. And really, I think, ended the last remnants of the Cold War anti-communism that I think really has profoundly shaped American politics. So I think it's really important to recognize that this is not sort of the potential of a movement. It is a movement, and it's had a really profound impact. And I think we should start by that. I think there are some important sort of levels of scale that we should keep in mind. So I think it's still a very small movement. I mean, if we compare it, I mean, it's interesting to me, the sort of attention that we've gotten to strikes last year. There were 16 strikes last year, major strikes. They involved 80,000 workers. In 2018, there were 20 strikes that involved 485,000 workers. So even just in that scale, it's very different from just a few years ago. But, you know, Lane talked about the 1970s. In 1974, there were 424 strikes that involved almost 2 million workers, right, in 1 year. And this, just the scale is very different. And I think we should be cognizant of that. I think we've seen, I think we have a tendency to sort of compare to sort of use the standard of comparison back to the sort of height of the labor union strength in the 1940s and 1950s, right? So we're constantly sort of comparing, you know, does union representation rates, you know, it's fallen from 33% roughly to about 10%. Now, I think in some ways, this is a moment that's much more typical of American history, in which we see unions have very little, workers have very little protection for forming unions. Movements erupt very quickly and then often spurt out very quickly. I mean, you can think about the Knights of Labor in the 1880s was the largest working class organization in the world. It had 800,000 members, roughly 20% of all wage earners in the United States. And a decade later, it was basically gone, right? And so I think in some ways, thinking about a number of things that would have to happen to turn this movement into a much more powerful movement. I think one, the sort of legal protections that may not look like the legal protections that, you know, supported the union movement in the 1930s, but there is a need for some dramatic labor changes to our labor laws to make it possible for people to form unions and to have representation at work without fearing for their jobs. I think an important part of that are the connections to the protections for undocumented workers, for pathways to citizenship that make it almost impossible for significant portions of the workforce to assert themselves on the jobs. I think also the connections to the issues that are raised by the Black Lives Matter movement around police brutality, which is a particular issue, I think, for the labor movement, given that 90% of the police in the United States belong to the labor movement. And also issues of voting rights. So I think these issues that are not perhaps directly related to sort of the shop floor, I think are really important for if this movement is going to become bigger than it is now to really address. So I look forward to the conversation.
Thanks, Will. Claudrina, would you like to jump in? I have a message that your audio is back on.
It is. My audio is back on.
Wonderful.
But my audio. So thank you so much for the opportunity to be a part of this important and critical conversation. I was, in March of 2020, I was teaching my labor history course. Since 2004, I've been teaching a course on the history of American labor from basically the Civil War to the present. And it was interesting in March 2020, as the pandemic hit and as students began to think about the fate of workers at our university, as people began to confront layoffs, as people begin to raise questions about the health and safety of workers. I think understanding the past became important. So by March, we had looked at the ways in which laboring women and men were shaped by the rise of big business. We had talked about the social upheavals of the World War I and World War II eras. We had talked about the economic hardships created by the Great Depression. And we had talked about the centrality and the importance of labor in labor trade union organizations in the struggle, not just for economic justice, but also for racial justice. And so by the time we got to March 2020, and I think I should probably say April or May of 2020, students had a deep appreciation for the importance of collective organizing, but also unionization and the critical role that labor unions can play. And they also had an awareness of, I think, some of the limitations of other strategies of resistance. In the wake of the pandemic, many organized around sort of mutual aid. And while that was so important for many students, I think some students recognized also the limitation of strategies when you don't have a union, when you are in a right to work state, when you are dealing with layoffs, and also when you are dealing in a political and cultural environment in which there's still a great deal of hostility towards workers and unions. I think while there is this valorization of the critical importance of essential labor, that does not necessarily mean that people are supportive of unions. And so one of the interesting things that happened in the spring semester of 2020, and I think continued in the fall semester of 2021, was this focus on the importance of unions. And while this is, I think, a unique moment, this is also a moment in which so many things that were important for folks who were a part of the Knights of Labor or the AFL or the CIO or the CEIU are still important today. I mean, we're still talking about critical issues like better wages, the right to union recognition, workplace conditions, hours. And I just want to continue to emphasize safety. I think some of the most critical battles of the 1970s, whether you were talking about hospital workers or steel workers, were around issues of health and safety. And that's still very much important. I think when I think about the question of anger, and I must admit, I had to go to the dictionary and say, okay, what does anger mean? For me, it's this question too of who and what is the object of our anger. And I think that's extremely important. Who and what is the object of our critique? Is it the state? Is it capitalism? Is it the employer? Is it other workers? How is it working across class? How is it working across occupations? I think these are important things that we need to think about. Another thing that I've been thinking about a lot, and I think is a challenge of this moment, is how does labor account for the reorganization of work itself? When I think about the history of labor struggles and labor battles, if you think about the post-World War I period, or you think about the post-World War II period, labor is not only fighting to ensure that they enjoy some of the benefits of the fruits of their labor, but they also are fighting against the reorganization of work itself. And I think one of the critical battles and one of the critical questions in our moment is confronting, even on college campuses, is that work is not going to look the same in 2023, 2024. It's just not. There are some real challenges. We have workers who are coming back, who have certain challenges. I mean, who have certain questions. Okay, I'm going to be working at home. Or I'm going to be working at the, at the place of employment. Like, so those are all critical questions as well in terms of how is work going to be organized. If we think about Amazon and we think about some of the things that are going on now in terms of volunteer time off, VTOs, right? How do we think about the organization of labor, the organization of work itself? And I think that's just extremely important too. So I'll just stop there. And those are just some of my thoughts. And once again, I'm so happy to be a part of this conversation and learn from my colleagues.
Thanks, Claudrina. This is really great way to sort of start the conversation. I'd like to pull a couple threads of points that were made, I think, by all of you. And Claudrina, I think you really sort of came back to this, and that's the question of what is the, where is the anger? Where is the anger being directed, right? And I think, Mariah, you said it's the system, and then, to Will's point, there's a lot of anger about the system, and we could talk about what that system is. But we're still working within sort of a labor environment that was formulated in the 1930s, right? That came out of the New Deal. We still have the NLRB as the major, sort of organizational space in which unions come to be recognized. We still have labor laws on the books that were passed and unwound and rewound and unwound again from the 1930s to today. So, when we think about the question of, what is catalyzing the worker, and I'm using that term broadly because we have many groups of workers, but what is catalyzing worker engagement in a new way, and activism? And, when we think of those sort of structural pieces that are in place that need to be reconsidered, how much of that is part of this movement? Do we need to just start from scratch? Do we need to completely rethink the way that we approach labor law in the country? Is it something that needs to take a more holistic approach? Does that make it too unwieldy? Does that make it impossible? So I'll sort of throw that out to all of you.
I'm going to say emphatically yes, in part because, again, the food system workers that I look at, farm workers, have historically been left out. And so we're, in the case of farm workers, they didn't have a high heyday. The UFW's impact was particularly important in the Southwest and California, but we know that there are other places agriculture is important. And I think, in essence, in farm work and also for domestic workers, they've been trying to battle against that law that really created this uneven playing field for, now close to 100 years, 90 years. And it hasn't, the fruits of their labor are questionable. We can't really say that they've, been able to organize all that effectively, at least farm workers in terms of unions, right? Again, saying UFW, that's the win, right? What about other places? What about, other unions? Not necessarily. And we can also see that the gains that the UFW made were also eroded. So limited gains and then a chipping away of them. So I emphatically say yes, they have to change.
And I think, Mariah, your point as well is well taken. That is a formal union structure still the structure that we need to move forward worker rights in the present moment and future? Go ahead.
I mean, I'd like to see that. I feel like worker centrists have come in. Other models of organizing have also, had some success. But the reality is, if we're talking about overhauling a system, that would be one place that the overhaul has been needed for a long time. And the overhaul is needed essentially also at this juncture when the H-2A program is expanding dramatically, where 250,000 of our agricultural workers are guest workers. And we can also say, because the common thing people say is, well, Americans don't want that job. No, Americans take all kinds of hard and difficult jobs. This is just the one that is the least compensated and dangerous. And it's really problematic. So I think one of the issues we also have to sort of see is, how do we think about a more sort of ambitious framework and legal framework that would be much more inclusive?
So I'll add to that. And also, I agree with Maria that we need fundamental reforms to our system. I've seen all these young people organizing recently, especially, the Starbucks, but other places too. There's been a real wave of young people, and a lot of them are, voting in labor board elections. And it's almost like I want to have an apology letter to them. Like, I'm so sorry that this is the best system, this is the system that you have to go through, because it is so fundamentally broken. In order to be a union member in this country, you have to jump through all these hoops to win a union election, right? First signing up cards, then enduring a union election campaign where the boss has full access to the workers and the union has no access in the workplace, where there are no fines at all when the employer breaks the law, right? And then at the end of that campaign, half of the workers have to vote for a union. And then the employer is supposed to sit down and negotiate a contract, but 30-40% of the time, those workers don't ever even get the first contract. The system is fundamentally broken, and that's just for the people covered by the National Labor Relations Act, right? That doesn't even include all the people we've been discussing who aren't covered, like agricultural workers, also like so many contract workers, gig workers, Uber drivers, et cetera, et cetera. The system is definitely broken, and so imagine for a moment, let's just imagine a moment where that tiny, that tiny funnel that workers have to go through to get a union. What if you flipped it and imagine a world that presumed that all workers had collective bargaining on their job and that workers could choose to opt out? Just imagine that world, right? Or imagine a world where there was bargaining on a mass scale through the government, and it was presumed that that would happen, right? In some ways, that's kind of how they do it in France. I mean, the union membership numbers in France are actually comparable to those in the US. 10.8% of French workers are members of unions. But of course, there's, much more close to universal coverage in terms of the collective bargaining, because it's embedded in their system in a different way. And so, the US is pretty particular about the way that we force workers to go through this very difficult, all these hurdles to get a union, and it's on a firm by firm basis. And so what that means is that the workers' unions are married to this broken system. Now, imagine a world in which workers were more free to, if collective bargaining was more universal, they could then form democratic organizations without ever having to endure the fire of the employer anti-union campaign. They could join organizations based on their industry, their community, not on their particular employer. And that may sound like a sort of pie in the sky approach, but I think it's worth putting out there just for the contrast, because there's just so many times when I have heard people say, oh, well, the labor movement, there's only 6% of the private sector, 10% overall, the movement is dying in this country. And then I look out and I see, half of people say they'd form a union tomorrow if given a chance. 77% of people 35 and under give a positive assessment of labor. That's according to the recent Gallup polling. There's all this organizing and organizations outside of collective bargaining, like Fight for 15, et cetera, et cetera. So there's a real disconnect in our system.
So there was a question that was dropped in the Q&A that I think dovetails with what we've been talking about, and Claudrina and Will, maybe you want to tackle this. And that's the question of where does the political process come into this conversation? Can, the question is, do they consequently believe that the political parties offer much less promise for workers' justice than in the past, in comparison to unions and collective action? So in our very broken political system right now, does politics still have a space in this conversation to shape new law, to shape worker agency, to remake a system that is more democratic, Lane, as you put it?
Go ahead, Claudrina, if you want to. I'll go.
I think it's all you, Will. Go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is really important, and I think it actually gets on some of the things that Mariah and Lane have been talking about in terms of, I mean, we have these sort of models in that are coming out of the organizing that I think addresses some of this. I mean, a lot of the organizing has actually happened outside of the National Labor Relations System. I mean, Fight for 15, for example, was an example of people saying, look, these are workers, fast food workers, because they are sort of they're organized into this, into the franchise system that makes it very difficult to find, to organize directly against their actual employer, right? Who denies being their employer. So they took a sort of a protest model of, protesting at these work sites and pressuring elected officials at the local level to support these demands for Fight for 15, and it's taken a really long time, but I think, now at the national level, that language has stuck. Biden can embrace it, right? And so that came not from demanding a union election. It was actually saying these are workers who are probably not going to be able to win a union election, but there are other ways to go about it. I think actually the farm workers, are a model for this also. Working at the state level to develop state level laws in places where they can be effective. Those laws are really important. They're not the National Labor Relations Act, but the California farm workers laws are important for people's daily lives. I think public employees are another example of this, a group that that was excluded from the Wagner Act, but in many states developed very robust and powerful collective bargaining laws, sort of modeled on the National Labor Relations Act. So we see, I think there's lots of these examples of organizing sort of outside of the system in ways that create alternatives to the system. I'd also point to home healthcare workers, right? Who, like their status even as employees is in question. But they've been able to, in some places, win collective bargaining rights. In other places, win at least recognition that they're workers and improve their wages and working conditions. In ways that, again, I think, these are small examples, but I think they provide some basis for thinking about creating a new sort of system for labor rights and protections.
Yeah, I'll just say briefly, I definitely think, the state matters. When I think about organizing, teachers organizing, I think if you look at what's happening in Chicago, you look at Illinois, you even look at the laws that exist and the ability to do that. The laws that exist at the state level in terms of public unions are just extremely important. And I can just say from, the perspective or the vantage point of, the state of Virginia right now and what's happening politically, it definitely matters in terms of larger conversations about wages, larger conversations about unionization. Who controls the state? It matters. It matters deeply.
Also muted. So a couple questions as well dropped in the Q&A, and I think it circles back to some points that were made earlier that, about the, if not the actual sort of numbers of strikes and, sort of, worker action, but the perception that there's a real surge happening. And so there were two questions. One is, how has the role of social media impacted labor activism, which I think is an interesting question. How can we were just talking how easy it was for us to get the word out about this panel, because you just retweet something and then it goes out and it goes out and it goes out and it goes out. So this question of, social media impacting labor activism, but I think also the question of how sort of the media information age, how all of that can play into either in a positive or a negative way labor activism in our current moment and in the more recent past. I think it's fair to sort of look back to sort of the early the 2007-2008 recession forward. I think we really can see kind of an arc of how that has become a more and more salient point and feature of organizing. So I'll throw that question out to all of you as well.
So I'm happy to talk about labor media. For many years in my tenure between being a union organizer and getting the PhD in history, I did media work for the National AFL-CIO. So, I remember when I started that work in the late 90s, there were probably 20 labor reporters. By the time I left in 2009, there were 3, and it was just so hard to get stories through the gatekeepers at the corporate media. It was very hard to get stories in about grassroots struggles. I remember, for instance, in 2003, there were major protests at the Free Trade Agreement of the Americas. There was a big protest in Miami, and there was practically no coverage. It just didn't get covered. Fast forward to today, and there's lots more coverage. And I think a few things have happened. One is the advent of social media challenged the role of those corporate medias who are the gatekeepers, right? And so we no longer, you don't have to just pitch the New York Times or the Post or the LA Times or whatever, because there's a whole level at which people can get the word out about grassroots activism. And so there's that. But I think there's another element, which is that there is a whole new generation of young labor reporters who came into the economy after the crash of 2008, 2009. They had they did not believe that, like much of their generation, they didn't believe the economic system was going to work for them. They came in very skeptical. They got their start with a lot of the digital media like Gawker, Vice. They organized those and began to write about workers' issues with sort of a new sensibility. And they, I think, have influenced the conversation. And now the legacy corporate media has sort of followed that more. Now, there have been some, like Steve Greenhouse has been writing, for years at the New York Times. So there are exceptions to this trajectory that I'm describing. But in general, I have to say, I am just delighted and sort of amazed by how much coverage there is of workers' issues in the media right now.
Did they keep piggyback on that? I will say one of the most powerful tools right now for workers are their phones. They're taking us in to the fast food restaurants, to the meat packing plants. They're taking us into factories. They're taking us to see their lives, and they're also giving testimony. So they're also at times cutting the journalists out and just saying, let me tell you what happened to me at work, or let me show you the inside of my work, even if it's briefly. And I think that there has been also really powerful for us to actually see the insides of these workplaces in ways that we hadn't before.
So barring any other comments on the sort of media front, we have about 5 minutes left in the conversation. And early in the session, in the chat, there was a question, and there were a few others that came in the Q&A related to how, in the changing moment and current moment that we're in, how do we teach labor history, and how has that changed? When we talk about labor history as a course, which I think all of us in some iteration teach or have taught, what are we teaching now? How do we approach our research? What are the new kinds of questions that we're asking that really are important to our, when we think historically, are important to inform our current moment?
Well, I started teaching at the University of Minnesota in 2016, and when I arrived here, there was a course on the books, and I believe the title was U.S. Labor History since, I don't remember when the starting point was, but it wasn't that long ago. I mean, for historians, maybe it was since I think it was in the 20th century, and I changed it to work and workers in the United States, and made it start before Columbus, right? And just to talk about to take a very long view, right? And I think that's really important for encouraging students to think about work as a historical topic and not just about labor. I'm not sure that what students hear when they hear the term labor. I'm not sure what it means to most students. But I think that traditionally it has meant the union movement. I have to say it's still not an extremely popular course. I don't have people banging down the doors for it. So maybe I don't know what I think there isn't, at least in my experience, still a sort of a huge demand for sort of courses specifically about work. I also, of course, integrate labor and working class history into everything I teach. So I think that's one way to do about it.
Maybe that's, oh, I'm sorry, Claudrina, go ahead, please.
Yeah, I've been teaching labor history since 2004, and to be perfectly honest, I initially had some resistance to it. And I try to tell my students this: I view myself as a historian of the African-American experience. I did not view myself as a labor historian. And when I got to the University of Virginia, they said, there was this class that Nelson Lichtenstein had been teaching, and they wanted me to teach. And I said, well, why? And they said, because you talk about Black workers in your work. And I think it was one of the things I always share with my students is how I conceptualized myself and how I did conceptualize myself. And so for me, it's about defining what labor is, but it's also about defining what a worker is. And I think one of the things that I've seen on campus recently and in campus movements, and a lot of this has been led by graduate students, is to have a more capacious definition of what constitutes a worker. And so there have been these conversations about, well, we all are workers. And I must be perfectly honest, at the same time, I struggle with that at times, because I think we need to always understand the distinctions and the differences and the different relationships that we have in terms of not just pay, but relationships to our employers, you can be on a campus and someone is working for the university and someone else is working, for a contractor or Airmark, or there are different relationships. And so for me, I think when I'm teaching this, I think I probably still teach it the old-fashioned way in terms of the labor movement, but also trying to have a capacious definition of worker so that all of my students can understand too that this is very much about them. But at the same time, getting them to think about the differences and the distinctions within this larger class of working people. And also, how do you do that in a country where sometimes workers' identity or working class identity is not shaped just by economics, but also around issues of culture and race and all of these other things, how we identify ourselves. So that's one of the things that I'm definitely trying to wrestle with, is this question of, what constitutes a worker and how do we all see ourselves to the capitalist political economy?
And I think that may be a perfect way for us to end this conversation. It leaves us thinking about intersectionality. It leaves us thinking with possibilities. It gets us thinking about identity and definitions. And we're right at time. So I'd like to thank all of our panelists, Claudrina Harold, Mariah Loez, Lane Wyndham, and Will Jones, for a really wonderful conversation. And thank you for everyone who has joined us, for your questions, for your engagement. And we hope that you'll join us for future of the Past seminars. So thanks very much.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.